Trying to find that line where fantasy and sci-fi cross over each other in both interesting and occasionally not so interesting ways has led me here. That, and I wanted to get that mild disappointments in Final Fantasy taste out of my mouth, and am currently too lazy to deal with the issues that the original 2008 Dead Space has, or the arguably more lengthy timesink that X4 is. I know that leading this review by saying this was my third choice might not be the absolute best idea, but for what it's worth, it's different enough from those titles that I have no problem admitting it. Tales of Arise is the 17th mainline entry into Bandai Namco's Tales JRPG series, also known as the Tales of series, which released in September of 2021. It follows the amnesiac Alphen, though he's introduced as Iron Mask, more details on that later, and Shionne, combating Renan lords for their own individual reasons. Either way, the overarching goal is Dahna's liberation from Rena, and it's not exactly what some might call a simple task by any stretch of the imagination, especially as the story progresses and more is revealed. There isn't that much I could find online about the specific background and historic details involving Arise's development, at least not nearly as much as I could about Final Fantasy XV. Either way, here's what I do have. Seeing the beginning of its developments before the Tales of Vesperia Definitive Edition announcement, it was also originally slated for a 2020 release date, but got delayed another year due to quality issues, though I am certain being able to release on more platforms might have helped solidify the idea. Unlike previous entries, it also used Unreal Engine 4 since all previous titles used an in-house game engine to run the game. Working on it were veterans of the Tales games, as well as newcomers including such names as Minoru Iwamoto and Motoi Sakuraba. The animation studio UFO Table, themselves responsible for working on Fate Stay Night and various other titles from Bandai Namco, like God Eater and Code Vein, were also involved, which isn't necessarily surprising since, as previously mentioned, they've done work on other Namco titles, which does in fact include other Tales games, most specifically Tales of Xillia, Xillia 2, Zestiria, and Berseria. Somewhat interestingly, UFO Table had a tax controversy back in 2019 and 2020. I don't think Namco has any immediately striking pseudo-controversies for comparisons at the moment, except for maybe the Pac-Mom thing, but that's not nearly as dire as tax fraud. Sidetracked myself. There was a fair amount of DLC released for the game, some at launch and some afterwards. Pre-ordering it, or later buying the pre-order bonus pack because yes, of course, would have gotten you some cosmetics and freebies, and in terms of DLC, that's more or less all that's available for you to get. Bonus stuff that increases certain aspects of the gameplay in a directly mechanical way, like increasing your experience gain or teaching you new food recipes, or cosmetics which don't do that. Some of these DLCs require some in-game work to get their rewards, like the Beach Time triple packs and School Life triple packs. You get the visual armor cosmetics right out of the gates, but to get the included weapons and their respective cosmetics, you have to beat the training battles that those DLCs add in. There is also a $28 DLC that adds in-battle tracks from previous Tales games, which isn't something I got because that seems a bit steep to me personally, and for another unrelated reason that I will touch on later. Having an extra 48 possible tracks for combat sounds nice, but it's wholly unnecessary. The same with some other aspects of the other DLCs. The Beach Time triple packs are split down the middle. $5 for one half of your team and another $5 for the other, so $10 total for the entire Beach Time triple pack. The same thing was done with the School Life and Warring States DLCs, though they all also come with their own unique background track. Although, and this is important, that background track isn't unique to each half, it's unique to the whole. So if you get one of the triple packs and then you get the other, you don't get another bonus track. It's the same track. You're paying for slightly less as a result. Outside of the cosmetics, the only thing with any real substance is the Sword Art Online collaboration pack. $16 for cosmetics for Alphen, Shionne, and Law, a new training fight, and a quest. The other DLCs, as previously mentioned, are more like DLCs of convenience. Single-time purchases, certainly, but there's no question that it would immediately give you in-game benefits. Spend $14 and get up to 40 free levels, free in air quotes for obvious reasons, or up to 400,000 gold by spending another 8. All in all, I've got mixed feelings on it. I don't really mind that there's cosmetics you can buy, and the fact that some of these, primarily cosmetic DLCs, also come with a challenge that gives you some rewards tied to that DLC is kinda cool. And thankfully it doesn't look like resources were more focused on the cosmetics than on the game itself, which is something I find myself saying increasingly less often lately, especially when it comes to early access games with cosmetics DLCs. I, however, don't like that some of these DLCs were needlessly split along gender lines. It's the same price for both halves, but it still feels pointless to have done so. Why not just have them all together in one thing? Well, yeah. The other pseudo-convenience DLCs are obvious plays for cash. All of these also feel like they should have been included in the Ultimate Edition of the game, at least I think so, both before and after pre-ordering the Ultimate Edition version of the game some time ago. Personally, I've always been of the mindset that if anything is considered the Ultimate Edition or definitive version of something, it should inherently come with everything that that thing could entail, including, yes, potential background tracks. I told you I'd touch on it later. Not the case here, unfortunately. You're still missing out on 16 pieces of DLC outside of the Tales of Arise Ultimate Edition, as according to Steam anyway. $110 potentially spent, but you don't get everything. Admittedly, that is primarily a monetary concern, and none of these things feel necessary towards the game feeling complete and whole, as it does feel that way even without the DLC. It does still feel a bit off to me, though. Arise is an interesting mixture of things thematically, wherein the two overarching elements of sci-fi and fantasy are largely held apart from each other, unlike, I don't know, Final Fantasy 15, for example, just a random name that popped in my head, not really sure why. There's a story reason for it, so that separation is largely forgivable. Traveling all across Dahna provides visually distinct biomes as well, which, when coupled with what Namco describes as a new graphic shader inspired by anime and watercolor painting, looks at times just stellar. From the harsh, heated wastes of Calaglia to the immediately following cold snowscape of Cislodia, a place which also hasn't seen the light of day in a long time, which is literal, by the way. It is always night there. My favorite areas are found later in the game, some of which are unfortunately spoiler-full, so I can't show them off as much as I'd like. Each of these areas comes with creatures called Zeugles, for those curious, that are distinctive to their regions as well. Some of these admittedly are just a palette-swapped version of a creature that already exists, but others simply aren't. Also, regional-specific music plays, my personal favorite of which is in the town of Niez, though the songs Where the Cold Glitters and Fierce Wind are pretty close on the list of tracks I greatly enjoy when I'm working on scripts such as this one. Key characters stand out due to their design, since making a character look unique is largely helpful in making them memorable. Kisara, the guard captain, still looks visually distinct from the other guards. Law, even as a Snake Eye, looked different from the other Snake Eyes. An unfortunate side effect of this, not specific to this one game, but is something that once you notice the pattern, it's one you can't really stop noticing, is you'll know the impact a character can and will potentially have on the story based simply on how they look or their interactions and lack thereof within the game's menus. Like a character design video game equivalent of profiling, but weirdly accurate. Another side effect is the resulting reuse of designs, like the aforementioned palette swap issue from earlier. A Renan guard from Calaglia will look strikingly similar to a Renan guard in Eldamen and Sia, though this won't always be the case. Still, these enemies and allies don't appear similar enough or often enough when they are similar as to be overbearing. There was one instance, however, where it just seemed lazy. There's a quest later in the game where Dohalim officiates a wedding between two people, one of which is a Renan guardsman, and even during that wedding ceremony, he still wears the whole outfit, that big-ass white, visually clunky armor on his wedding day. I don't know why. There are a few arguably minor issues that I also want to bring up, the first being the relatively common pop-in issue and skits having weird backgrounds if you've turned off the depth of field effect in the options menu. Instead of looking the way that background would normally look in those skits, instead it just looks kind of blocky. They probably didn't expect people to turn off the depth of field effect, but the fact that they didn't seem to have any kind of backup plan around that possibility seems weird. Another more frequent and less easily fixable issue is that occasionally there are text problems, wherein the text doesn't match up with what's actually audibly said. You'll see it most often during skits, but there's one repeating instance you might hear/read when in combat between Alphen and Shionne. It isn't game-breaking, but all of these issues are distractingly noticeable, and some even seem like they should have been fixed by now, a year and a half after its release.
I sense a strange power from it. We should gather as many as we can find.
You're mine! It's over! I'm on it! Take this! It's over! That's...
Glanamede Castle. How come you don't have a scar on your hand?
a scar? What do you mean?
The Crimson Crows all tore off their own spirit cores, right? But your hand doesn't show any signs of ever having a core like theirs.
Oh.
I see that the interior of the wedge is every bit as strange and unusual as the exterior. Intriguing.
The story of Tales of Arise follows the amnesiac Iron Mask, later revealed to be named Alphen after regaining an incredibly small portion of his memories a few hours into the game, and Shionne. Alphen is a Dahnan slave, working to liberate his fellow Dahnans from the cruel rule of the Renans. Shionne is herself a Renan, looking to obtain the Master Course from the 5 Renan Lords, overseeing the various regions of Dahna. These Renan Lords are here participating in something called the Crown Contest, the winner of which will be declared sovereign and rule over the Renan people, and as a direct result, the Dahnans as well. Their dynamic is initially built on the fact that Alphen can't feel pain, and Shionne is cursed by what she calls her thorns, which causes immense pain to anyone who touches her or anyone she touches. Save, of course, for Alphen, since again, no pain, no gain. The two join forces, and through their combined forces, and for their own reasons, seek out to liberate Dahna from Rena, which is where the first interesting thing comes in. Dahna and Rena are more than just separate countries, they're separate planets, and you can regularly see Rena hanging in the sky, with Lenegis, a satellite between the two, often obstructing part of it. Apparently, some 3 centuries prior to the game's events, Rena invaded Dahna, and even at the time were so technologically advanced that Dahna, whose society was, and even still is, largely medieval in terms of real-world comparisons, lost outright. This technological advantage is so great that Renans have gone out of their way to make sure that Dahnans just don't have access to it, hence why I can forgive the divide between sci-fi and fantasy that's found throughout the game. More than just being technologically advanced, though, Renans can also use astral arts, something akin to magic that generally no Dahnans can use. They've really been given the short straw in life, let's be honest, and this overwhelming power difference has caused any chances at rebellion to be quelled in short order. Along the way in defeating these Renan lords, you naturally learn about new things involving the world you inhabit and gain allies to help you throughout your revolutionary endeavors. For the most part, the characters in their respective arcs are fairly well done, although I think Alphen and Kisara both don't have nearly as much of an arc in the same way that Shionne and the others do, and they seem relatively one-note within the confines of the story. Which isn't to say that they aren't enjoyable characters, though. The only one that I didn't really like too much upon her introduction is Rinwell, but there's a story reason why she acts the way she does. There are 2 noticeable issues within the story, though. Well, I mean, the first one is only semi-noticeable. Tales of Arise's skits, which are these cutscenes that help portray the story and showcase what exactly is going on and further solidify character growth and traits. But sometimes these skits act as if some characters haven't had their arcs occur yet, even when they have, but most skits you see are optional in that there's an on-screen prompt you must press in order to watch the skit at all, and if you miss it, you can watch the skits you've missed via the Campfire's Reminisce option. But this can be after the arc has occurred, even if that skit would have shown up before it and you just didn't catch it. While not always the case, it should be noted that sometimes these skits, since they can be viewed at potentially any time, might not have been made with the premise of these arcs previously occurring. At the same time, some of these skits also function as if these arcs have occurred, even though they haven't. I don't think their solution of allowing the player to choose if and when they watch a skit is necessarily perfect, but I prefer it to the alternative of skits interrupting gameplay with how constant they can spring up and how numerous they can be by the end of the game. The other major issue is that there's negligible build-up towards the enemies you face. Each region you enter has a Renan Lord you have to deal with in one way or another, and these lords aren't really mentioned or built up, outside the regions you eventually deal with them in. The closest that happens is when Balsef, the Lord of Calaglia, gets a call from Ganabel, the Lord of Cislodia. This almost happens again later on between 2 characters I won't mention due to spoilers, but the interaction is exceedingly brief and mostly done for the benefit of the one being introduced, since you just dealt with the other one. They aren't really given too much room to operate or individualize themselves outside of how they treat other people within their region, and some are so comedically evil that it can be hard to take them seriously if not for the main party's interactions with them. There are also moments where it seems like the game might be going in a specific interesting direction, but then it just doesn't. Niaz is actually a really good example, but I can't say why because, again, of spoilers, and this is one of those games where I don't want to talk about spoilers because they're spoilers and I want people to have a fresh eye going into it. Even the final boss I was expecting to go one way, and while it didn't at first, and then took my expectation and went slightly sideways with it, I am happy that I almost caught it. Though I don't know if that speaks more to my experience of playing games for 2 decades or more to a perceived predictability of some of its story elements. Sometimes this is for the better, and sometimes it isn't. It doesn't actually serve up any concrete answers to some of the questions it poses at times. What do you do when you overthrow an evil force only for another to fill the vacuum left behind? When do good intentions and faith in leadership become blind loyalty and unquestioning obedience? Can hate itself be a force for good, and if not, what do you actually do with it when it defines your life for such a long period of time? How do you obtain coexistence between two groups of people who have historically hated each other for literal centuries, and for good reason? Is it responsible to pursue a dream without considering its potential consequences? Are you personally responsible for the dreams of the dead? No, the story focuses on the combined goal of Dahna liberation between this group of friends, and in terms of the story itself, it's pretty good. It just doesn't go into the nitty-gritty details of what that actually is, beyond the, beating the shit out of people part. The backbone of trying to bridge the gap between Dahnans and Renans, seen through the eyes of 6 people who all come from different aspects of life within those worlds, all the while looking to change the status quo through force where necessary and through debate where not, and by where not, I mean almost never. It's pretty good. It just doesn't go into the minutia as much as you might want it to. This is an action RPG in the truest sense of the word. No hold down the button the whole time here. No sir, yes, I'm still annoyed. The combat system primarily works using combos, stringing chains of basic attacks and skills together to unsurprisingly deal damage. The amount of basic attacks you can make in a row is slim at first, but it increases as you progress through the game and accumulate SP, skill points, that you can then spend to garner new skills and upgrades for your characters. This is itself separate from the levels the characters gain, which itself hinges on the experience you gain through the same combat that you get SP through. You can also gain SP and experience as well as potentially other rewards through the game's story and subquests, and also gain bonuses from eating food at campfires or inns that could potentially affect both experience and SP, among other things. Like that info dump? Like that there was no segue between any of those lines? Good, that's how I do things around here. Something else affecting combat is a staggering system, which allows you to effectively instantly defeat a single enemy, or more situationally once the diamond fills up. You can outright stagger certain enemies using the BG abilities of your allies, thus gaining a brief period of time where you can just unload with little to no consequence. Flying foe? Shionne. Fleet-foot fucko? Dohalim. Charging cheat? Kisara. Armored ass? Law. Magic Menace? Rinwell. It's a nice little way to spice things up, and in addition to the fan-favorite mystic arts, makes the combat a flashy, frenetic funhouse, primarily focused on your skills as the player as opposed to anything else. When it comes to the completionists, you'll need to go back into the game after beating it initially to really get everything. Most specifically, the subquests, the Reminiscence Device, Another Hillside Anomaly, its immediate follow-up, Otherworldly Visitors, and Record Collection are only made available after beating the game, and are required for the Problem Solver achievement. But don't think that it's easy. Well, okay, no, Record Collection, that subquest, that one is really easy. It's just a lot of fast traveling and talking to people. But the Reminiscence Device and Otherworldly Visitors, on the other hand, those are some of the most difficult fights in the entire game. If you're curious about how difficult, well, see, Otherworldly Visitors houses the best armor and potentially the strongest weapons in the entire game. The armor is pretty simplistic, offering no benefits beyond the high stats you likely expect from armor you get after beating the game, as far as you'd be concerned at that point anyway. The weapons, however, they're the interesting ones. The weapons are the Devil's Arms, a staple in the Tales series. Earlier, you might have noticed that I had to specify that they are potentially the strongest weapons. There is a catch. At first, a Devil's Arms basic stats are low, like really low, like really low, like so low that at first you might be mistaken for thinking that they are insultingly weak considering where you get them from and what you had to do to get them. But the catch is their stats increase with every single kill you make with the character that arm belongs to, and this tally includes kills made prior to obtaining the arm. This is done at a 1-to-1 ratio, so every individual kill causes all the stats that a Devil Arm affects to increase by 1. This double-edged sword can be worth it for a main character that you use for the majority of the game, such as for myself Alphen, since he largely killed every enemy or at least landed the final blow and thereby killed them. His double arm nebulum here is exceedingly powerful. The best part is this stat increase persists through New Game Plus, but again, this is a reward for running the gauntlet through some of the most lethal enemies in the entire game. Keep that in mind. Thankfully, almost all subquests, including the ones that I just mentioned, automatically appear as being available on your fast travel maps selection, apart from a select few. You can look those up on your own time if you'd like, but there's one that you should definitely do. In your travels, you might spot these owls, and finding them gives you a cosmetic item and attachment that you can equip to a character. At first, by the end of the game, and through that questline's progression, however, you can come across different owls that give you artifacts, and these artifacts they give you are really good. Arise kept the Devil's Arms, but they did do away with another staple of a Tales game, the grade points. Previous titles, you would earn grade points based on how well you did in combat, and you'd spend these accumulated points when going into New Game Plus to decide what, if anything, carries over into the following playthrough. Grade points aren't here, so you can't do that. Instead, there are artifacts that you can find that decide what you carry over, and some of these artifacts are found from these endgame owls. And before you ask, artifacts always carry over, and depending on the specific artifact, you can turn on and off their effects at any time. In a cute detail, these artifacts are referential to other Namco titles. I keep forgetting Bandai Namco owns Pac-Man, but there it is, immortalized in stone in a different, unrelated, non-Pac-Man game. There are plenty of things to do outside combat, though. When I say plenty, there's skits, the subquests, which often fall into either getting specific items for characters or beating enemies, talking with your party members at a campfire, combating the optional giant enemies, the equally optional training grounds combat encounters, and fishing. Fishing is the only one that's different from the norm, itself being a rather simple minigame. You know what, now that I'm saying this out loud, there's just actually not that much that isn't directly tied to the primary gameplay loop the game offers, you know, the combat and dialogue. As a result, the game doesn't feel like you're doing anything that could be called filler or unnecessary. You don't feel like you're wasting your time normally. Like, there's definitely things you don't have to do at all, but in doing them, it doesn't feel forced, which is great, in my opinion. Tales of Arise is an action-focused JRPG developed and published by Bandai Namco, and it offers a really fun, skill-based combat system. The story's overall pretty good, though there are definitely moments where it could have been done better. Villains didn't have too much build-up, but the ones who did were well worth the build-up they had. The environments are varied and interesting, and enemies found therein were interesting and mechanically varied and distinct enough that the same combat loop doesn't get stale often. I recommend it, and if you still have doubts, I would wait for a sale, but I'm still inclined to recommend it. Having said that, some of the DLC you can justifiably steer clear of, especially when there are other methods to obtain what they offer. Next up is a story or 2, or 3, or even Diablo 4 if I can get my hands on it. Going through some home stuff right now, don't worry about it, I'll see you later. Story out.